concentrations here of the constant constituents of the atmosphere. By far your largest constant constituent is nitrogen, N2, diatomic nitrogen. I have a little pie chart that I made down there at the bottom, and you can see that about 78% of Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen. It's a very large amount of the atmosphere is nitrogen. It has a very large reservoir, we would say. It has a very long lifetime. We've already seen that it was something like 42 million years for a typical nitrogen molecule. There are really very few sources and sinks of nitrogen. That's why the concentration has gotten so high, and it doesn't tend to get depleted. Just certain bacterial processes at it now. We'll see in a little bit that most of this nitrogen actually came from volcanoes early in the history of the Earth. Your second constant constituent is oxygen, which comes in at around 21%. Oxygen has important sources and sinks. A source of oxygen to the atmosphere is photosynthesis. Plants, in the presence of light, use their chlorophyll to produce sugars, and a byproduct of that is oxygen. Oxygen gets added to the atmosphere. But it's approximately in balance with the amount of oxygen that is removed by the sinks of oxygen. What are the sinks of oxygen? Processes that remove oxygen from the atmosphere? Mostly respiration by plants and animals. By animals. I guess plants too, come to think of it. And combustion. Fire takes oxygen out of the atmosphere. But these two processes are approximately in balance. Your third and fourth constituents of the atmosphere, you can see if you add up 78% to 21%, you got 99%. There's not much to the atmosphere other than nitrogen and oxygen. So the next two gases are argon and neon, each of which well less than 1% of the total atmosphere. Argon and neon are very inert gases. They don't really have any sources and sinks to speak of. They were originally added to the atmosphere by processes associated with volcanoes. Okay, so those are our constant constituents. You can go to the top of a mountain, you can go to the middle of a desert, you can go up in a hot air balloon. There's still going to be 0.9% of the atmosphere is going to be argon. And 78% of the atmosphere is going to be nitrogen, and so on. That's not the case with the variable constituents. We're going to talk about the concentrations of four important variable constituents of the atmosphere here in just over the course of the next few minutes. And the first one I want to talk about is water vapor. Water vapor makes up somewhere between 0 and 4% of the Earth's atmosphere, although concentrations typically average right around 0.25%. So well less than 1% of the atmosphere is typically made up of water vapor. And if you look at something like a satellite picture, you can see that the study of where there is and where there is not a lot of water vapor is a big part of what an atmospheric scientist does. And so we have to know, for example, where is there dry air, where is there humid air, where is there clouds, where are there no clouds, etc. The variability of water vapor is in fact an important aspect of meteorology. If we switch to carbon dioxide, we can see that while the concentration varies quite a bit from place to place and from time to time, it averages about 0.038%. What ways does carbon dioxide vary? Well, there are two basic factors here. There's a trend. If we look at this graph of carbon dioxide concentrations over the last 40 years, you can see that there's a big trend as due to the burning of fossil fuels. As mankind burns fossil fuels, they emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And you can see that there is an annual cycle as well. You can see there's kind of a little peak and a little valley each year. And that has to do with the fact that the important source of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is animals by their respiration, and the important sink is the photosynthesis in plants. Well, the trouble is there's a lot more plants in the northern hemisphere than there are in the southern hemisphere. There's just more land in the northern hemisphere than there is in the southern hemisphere. So in northern hemisphere winter, when all the plants are dead, there's nothing taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and so concentrations of carbon dioxide go up. And then in the northern hemisphere summer, there's lots of plants, and they take lots of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so concentrations go down. Our third most important variable constituent of the atmosphere is going to be ozone. We're going to talk a lot in the coming days about ozone, but for today we just want to talk about the fact that overall ozone averages very little of the atmosphere, something like 0.01%. Now, ozone actually occurs. It varies in both elevation, as seen in this little diagram over here on the left side of the screen, where in some layers of the atmosphere there's virtually no ozone, and in other layers of the atmosphere there's a lot of ozone. In other words, in the ozone layer there's a lot of ozone. Or if you look at the panel on the right, you can see that the amount of ozone varies from place to place. In this case, you can see how in the ozone hole over Antarctica, there's practically no ozone at all. The sources and sinks of ozone are actually pretty complex. We're going to talk about that in another lecture. There's complicated chemical reactions that are what describe how the ozone is produced and destroyed in the atmosphere. Our final variable constituent of the atmosphere is methane. Methane, again, varies quite a bit from place to place and from time to time. Its total, its average is quite a small number. What do I have here? 0.00017%. That's on the order of parts per billion, our methane. Methane, on the other hand, varies in the sense that it has increased with respect to time. If you look at this graph of the amount of methane in the atmosphere over the last few decades, you can see that the methane concentrations have been increasing. Well, that's because there are a number of human activities that increase methane in the atmosphere. For example, high-density cattle yards tend to have a lot of cattle living in a small area, and they tend to get certain diseases that increase the amount of flatulence they produce. Cattle flatulence is primarily methane. Termites produce methane. Termites live on wood that people have cut down and made homes out of and so on, and termites' digestive tract produces lots of methane. Rice paddies, the way that we grow rice in Asia, for example, is a important source of methane to the atmosphere. These are all things that have increased over the last few decades, and so the concentrations of methane are increasing. Now, I want to stress, you don't have to know these exact percentages as to how much of each of these gases are in the atmosphere, but you do need to know, for example, the order in which they occur. What's the most abundant gas? What's the next most abundant gas? And so on. We talked about the fact that the atmosphere is made up of a mixture of gases and solids and liquids called aerosols. Let's spend a minute here to talk about aerosols. Aerosols are suspended little particles of either solids or liquids in the atmosphere, and for technical reasons, if they're made out of water, either they're ice or they're liquid water, they're not an aerosol. They're cloud droplets then. Examples of aerosols: soot, smoke, dust, salt, pollen. Salt? Where's salt coming from in the atmosphere? Actually, the atmosphere contains a lot of salt. When the ocean, of course, is salty, and when water droplets from like a wave breaking are sprayed into the air in the form of sea spray, a lot of times they'll evaporate before they hit the ground, but since there's a little bit of salt in that water, it gets suspended in the atmosphere as a little crystal of salt. So there's a lot of salt in the atmosphere, and all these aerosols are going to play an important role in the production of clouds, as we're going to see in just a little bit. Okay, one last little topic to talk about before we wrap up this lecture. I want to talk about, where did all these gases in the atmosphere come from? What was the origin of our atmosphere? It might seem like a silly question. You might think that the atmosphere just formed as the Earth formed. And in fact, as the Earth formed out of the clouds of dust and so on, and during the period of planet formation about 4 billion years ago, an atmosphere did form with the Earth. But that Earth atmosphere was primarily made up of hydrogen and helium. Now, these gases are not conducive to life, and they are actually very, very light, and they are very hard for the relatively weak gravity of the Earth to hold down, and so these gases quickly escaped. Fortunately, we were able to build a second atmosphere, and the second atmosphere that we produced is basically the one we have now. Now, most of the constituents of the second atmosphere were added to the atmosphere by volcanic outgassing. Now, when you think of a volcano erupting, you're probably thinking of lava and pumice and things like that. But a lot of what a volcano is giving off is gas. I mean, if you think about the stereotypical picture of a volcano, you can see all this gas is bubbling out of it. This is where we get most of our nitrogen, our carbon dioxide, even our water vapor came largely from volcanic outgassing. But one important gas did not come from volcanic outgassing, and that's oxygen. No oxygen comes from volcanoes. Rather, oxygen is completely just a byproduct of photosynthesis. There couldn't be oxygen in Earth's atmosphere until there was life to release the oxygen into the atmosphere. So until plant life evolved about 2.5 billion years ago, there was no oxygen, and then the oxygen levels increased until about 300 million years ago or something like that, and they have been steady somewhere around 21% of the Earth's atmosphere since then. Okay, well, we'll talk more about some of this stuff. We'll review this a little bit in class, but you are responsible for this material for the first test. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. This has been Dr. John Schrage.